Good afternoon, everyone. Russell Holden with Render Plus Software. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. Today's webinar topic is adding lighting to SketchUp models. The rendering program that we're going to use is iRenderNext. For anyone out there who may have one of our other rendering programs, for example, Aerial Vision or 3D Design Studio, what you'll discover is that the methods used to add lighting to SketchUp models is exactly the same. So even if you're not specifically using iRenderNext, this is going to be a very meaningful webinar for you. I want to encourage everyone to bookmark the Render Plus Systems YouTube channel. There are past webinars stored on our YouTube channel. In addition, there are lots of tutorial videos, all developed to help you build up your skills with iRenderNext. Some of those videos are created by us here at Render Plus Software. Other videos have been created by end users, so you get not only our perspective on how the software can be employed to generate photorealistic renderings, but you'll get the perspective of end users as well. RenderPlus.com is also a valuable resource. You might want to bookmark our domain as well. You'll find comprehensive documentation on iRenderNext. You can that's available in book form. It's also available online. And you'll find lots of interesting resources to help you become an expert user with iRenderNext quickly. If you have a tutorial, or excuse me, if you have a trial version of our software, you may find that our toolbar doesn't load automatically. That can happen from time to time if that's the case. Click Extensions in SketchUp, look for iRenderNext 6 load, click it, and our toolbar will install. By default, it's going to install adjacent to the SketchUp toolbar. I peel it away. I've done so for the purposes of this webinar so that we can stay really focused on iRenderNext features. The model that I'm going to use is, I have a couple of models that I'm going to use. The first one is this beach cottage, which I have to tell you, I got this from the SketchUp 3D warehouse. And without doing anything to it at all, the first thing that I do when I load a model is I render it. That way I can check materials, kind of see what the situation is with how the model was constructed. I embellish it only slightly, and that embellishment included just adding some lighting. When I click on the render button, that's this green dot, the first dialog that appears is the render settings dialog. And you will notice that across the top of this dialog is a section called lighting presets. These are natural lighting presets. They don't have anything to do with artificial lighting, natural lighting only. Now the three in the middle are pretty self-explanatory. They are toggles for the SketchUp sun position. But the two on the outside are maybe not so obvious, and I thought that I might spend a few minutes describing some of the benefits of Studio High Dynamic Lighting and also the use of a high dynamic range image in your render. Studio High Dynamic Lighting is actually a pretty easy to understand concept. It's no different than you taking your model to a photographer, letting the photographer set up the lights and filters and all of the great things that photographers do to deliver to you in the end a professional photograph of your model. Studio High Dynamic Lighting does exactly the same thing. It is a multiple light source solution for your rendering. And when I just render an overview of my model, this is the rendering that gets produced with just Studio High Dynamic Lighting illuminating the model. You'll notice that the shadows are quite subtle. That's from multiple light sources being used, and all faces of the model are nicely illuminated. A better rendering maybe that illustrates Studio High Dynamic Lighting is this nice little table. This is rendered with just Studio High Dynamic Lighting, and you'll notice that there are multiple shadows underneath the table. That's a proof to you that this is multiple light sources. And you'll also notice the nice top of this table, which illustrates this material sampled in direct bright light in filtered light, and then additionally in shadow. So Studio High Dynamic Lighting is a very appropriate lighting solution for simple objects like tables or furniture, maybe just SketchUp components that you build, but additionally can be quite handy even for architectural models. Now this is in iRenderNext. When I click the clipboard, I get an expanded view of rendering options. Here again is the preset dialog, and you'll notice that instead of Studio High Dynamic, I've clicked Exterior with Sun. This lighting solution is going to use as a primary light source the SketchUp sun position. There are also secondary light sources that are captured from the SketchUp sky. That allows all of the surfaces in the model to be illuminated. Now there are a couple of things going on that it's important for you to understand. First of all, this is a rendering of the SketchUp sky produced by iRenderNext. In addition to the sun position, which as I mentioned is a primary light source, there are secondary light sources being introduced to the model. They are from points in the sky, and the brightness of those lights is determined by the brightness of the area of the sky where the light source originates. That's the first part of giving us a very well illuminated model. Secondly, iRenderNext is bouncing light off of the model surfaces. That also is illuminating the model. For example, although the underside of this porch is dark, it is being illuminated by bounced light off of the ground. Were it not being illuminated, it would be perfectly black. You'll also notice in this rendering that we're getting very nice reflections of this bright, perfectly clear sky in the glass on this model. Now, when you select a preset, you can select any preset that you want. So this is going to seem ridiculous, but when I select interior no sun and then render my model, I'm going to get a very interesting image. And I'm hoping it's what you expect. There's no illumination whatsoever on this model because the sun has been turned off. Now, you'll notice none of the presets are selected. And the only thing that I've checked is right here. I've checked sky. So the reason that interior with no sun is no longer selected is because as soon as I click sky, the definition of interior no sun is no longer met. Because of that, this is unchecked. And now when I render, I get a SketchUp rendering just using the SketchUp sky. Now I mentioned that this is a multiple light source solution for the rendering. And you can tell that that's so because, once again, the underside of the porch is not totally black. It is being illuminated by bounce lighting. But notice also underneath this overhang, the subtle shadows that are getting produced. The light source that's missing, of course, is the SketchUp sun, but the light sources from the sky by themselves will cast shadows. So we've used Studio High Dynamic, we've used exterior with sun, we've used interior no sun. You've probably caught on that interior with sun will simply turn on the SketchUp sun and allow light to invade the space, provided, of course, there are openings. The next one that is very interesting and probably the most impressive is using a high dynamic range image to both illuminate the model and also, in this case, being used as a background for the rendering. We have a library, we have a library of HDR skies that are included with iRenderNext. The one that I'm going to select is this sunset image. And what I want you to notice is that you're able to rotate or spin this HDR image around your model in order to position the image properly. Now, you'll notice the sun is setting. Because this is the brightest point of light in this image, that's actually going to be used as the sun. With the sunset image as a background, the reflections in the glass are certainly improved. Most interesting is you'll notice the warm hue of the rendering, especially the building. Because at sunset, of course, the sun is more red, and the color of the light is being used on all of the materials. So I get a very warm rendering of my model. If you compare that to the bright daylight image, I think you'll agree that this rendering of the model is considerably cooler. Here are the two side by side just to allow you to compare. Again, a very bright and perfectly clear SketchUp sky, and I get a cool or neutral rendering of my image. When I introduce the sunset image for my background and for illuminating the model, I get a much warmer rendering of my building. So it's not only the background that is important to consider. Additionally, you want to consider the quality of the light that's going to be used to render your model. Now this gets interesting because when you're using a high dynamic range image, by default, the SketchUp sun is going to be turned off. I clicked sun on the Setup Options menu. And so, as you already know, that means that the definition for this preset, HDRI Sky Plus background, that definition isn't met anymore. However, the HDRI Sky background is still going to be used. It's going to be used to illuminate the model. It's being used as the background. In addition, I am turning on the SketchUp sun. And so now the result is I have a wonderful sky background illuminating my model. I have the sun from this render or from this image making my model considerably warmer in the completed rendering, and I get the added benefit of sun shadows from the SketchUp sun position. When you click this chandelier icon, this is the Render Ready Components dialog. This is a very nice library of light fixtures with bulbs already set, the wattage for the bulbs preset, the color of the bulb preset, and in addition, we're going to be looking at this in some detail a little bit later, but you have the ability to set the lighting channel. When lighting, and bear with me, I'm going to explain in a lot of detail what lighting channels are all about, but for now I just want you to know that when set to 0, iRenderNext will assign a lighting channel for the fixture automatically. So if you don't worry, if you're not too concerned about having control over the lighting channels, you can let iRenderNext set it for you automatically. If you have a very deliberate plan for your model and for how you'll manipulate lighting, then set the channel on your own, which I've done here. I've set this light for the porch to light channel 3. So there's the porch light in place. Now I've also added some garden lights. They're hard to see in the line drawing. And I've also added some recessed lights underneath this overhang. The clipboard, if you remember, brings up the big suite of rendering options. What I want to do is I want to turn off the SketchUp sun. And you'll notice that as soon as I do that, HDRI sky plus background is selected again. That's because the only reason that the definition wasn't met was because I snuck in here and turned on the sun. So when the sun is turned off, HDRI sky and background is the preset again. So without the sun, I'm getting, the image is considerably darker, and you'll notice that the porch light is rendering, but it's rendering as a very bright white light. That's your first indication that sometimes manipulating the color of the light is pretty important. So to do that, when I right-click on the light fixture, I get this pop-up that gives me the opportunity to edit the light fixture. So for example, instead of such a cool light, I'd actually like a light that's a little bit warmer. If the bulb in this fixture is an incandescent bulb, as you all well know, incandescent bulbs are considerably warmer. So we need to decrease the green and blue and make this light very red. When I do and I re-render the model, I get what is a much more realistic lighting against my building. And again, assuming, of course, that that's an incandescent bulb. You'll notice on the left, it's the same HDRI background with a very white light. On the right, the HDRI background again, and this time with a bulb where I've paid attention to the bulb color. There are actually very few artificial lights that will illuminate with perfectly white light. Very few. I mentioned lighting channels earlier, and I showed you that by default, you know what? Let me pause because I have a question. And if I'm going to encourage questions, let's make sure we get them answered. Can you make your own light fitting designs? The answer is yes. You might, for example, go to the SketchUp 3D warehouse and pull out a light fixture that will not have a bulb in place based on the iRenderNext definition. If that's the case, you can actually add a bulb to the fixture, specify the attributes for that bulb, for example, the wattage of the bulb, the color of the bulb, how light is spread from the bulb or distributed into the space, and then additionally specify the lighting channel. You certainly could even make your own lamps or fixtures from scratch in SketchUp. Not difficult to do. Or as you say in the States, fixture. Ah, Rich, you just gave it away that you're from Canada, eh? Now, I mentioned before that if you set the light channel to 0, iRenderNext is going to set the lighting channel for you automatically. If you specify a lighting channel, you can also name the channels. The lights that I've added to this model, it's pretty simple. I mentioned before, I added some garden lights. I added the porch light, and I added 3 recessed lights underneath that overhang. The porch light is currently turned on. That's what this checkbox is. And the brightness of that porch light is 0.8. The highest value is a 1. With these up and down arrows or the slider bar, you can brighten or dim a fixture or collection of fixtures. The check mark is an on-off switch. The purpose of this dialog is to allow you, in a completed rendering, to balance your lighting solution. That's the purpose. So you don't really need to know everything about how a light fixture or a collection of lights is going to illuminate a space prior to committing your computer to a rendering. And once the rendering is completed, you can post-process the rendering using our lighting channels dialog to balance the lighting for your completed presentation image. A wonderful feature of iRenderNext. In this example, I'm just going to turn on the porch lights and the lights, the recessed lights, and now I have a very nice completed rendering, an evening rendering of my model. I made this quick rendering because what I wanted to offer as a proof is a little space, obviously very simple, with a spotlight pointed against one wall. This is the only light source illuminating this model. Okay, I have a question. That's excellent. Can you show how you opened the lighting channels dialog box again, please? Absolutely. The way that you open the lighting channels dialog is click this light bulb icon on the iRenderNext toolbar. If you're using aerial vision, the light channels dialog is not available. That's an advanced feature that is included in iRenderNext, not aerial vision. Thank you for the question, and I need everyone attending to make sure that if I have not made something clear, for example, how to get the light channels dialog to display, let me know. So I want to make sure that you all understand how to do that. So this is a very simple little model. I hope no one's insulted. It's so simple. But I just wanted to illustrate that there is one point light hitting the wall. And that single light is in fact illuminating this whole model. And it's able to do that because light is bouncing off of surfaces. And to further illustrate how nicely light is bouncing, look at the back of this column. If there were no light at all on this column, it would be perfectly black, the back of the column. Additionally, because it is this wood surface and not very reflective, it's not doing much to illuminate when light bounces off of it, and it also is not especially bright from the bounced light. So the lighting is physically accurate when you add artificial lights to your SketchUp models and then render with iRenderNext. And then this next rendering, I just wanted to show you again how important it is to pay a lot of attention to the color of the light. You may, in some cases, spend quite a lot of time deciding, for the purposes of your models, the appropriate RGB values for, and I'll go back to the example of an incandescent bulb. It needs to look like an incandescent bulb on your computer screen and based on what you believe an incandescent bulb looks like. There are lots of resources on the internet, by the way, who will give you the right recipes for different bulb types. And the only thing that you need to watch out for when you use them is, unless your monitor is tuned for color exactly like theirs, you may need to make a few adjustments. So keep that in mind. I want to just ask, is that clear to everyone? It's not just about running out to the internet and grabbing someone else's idea of the RGB blend for an incandescent bulb. You also need to adjust those colors to make sure that based on how color on your monitors are tuned, you'll get an incandescent bulb. So on my computer right now, this really looks like an incandescent bulb illuminating the light, or illuminating the wall. If it's not quite right on your screen, it's because your monitor is simply not tuned like mine. This illustrates the importance of color when you are positioning lights in your model. Look at how different these models look. I have to admit to you, I did kind of exaggerate the red bulb a little bit because I really wanted everyone to understand that if your goal is photorealistic rendering, the way that materials interact with lights is greatly influenced by the color of the light. And once again, I'm just going to say, I hope this is not insulting to anyone, but it is sometimes one of those things that, of course, it's obvious, but we need to be reminded of it from time to time. You know what? In iRender Next, you can actually make anything behave like a light. So I've got that goofy thing hanging on the wall, on the brick wall, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a parameter that will cause it to render as though it were a light. So I'm making it glow with 40 watts. And now look at what happens. Look how what I did, by the way, was I made the material glow at 40 watts. The gotcha, if you're not careful, could be that you have this material assigned elsewhere in your model, and so you could get some surprises. In this example, I don't. I was actually very careful to make sure that the only place that this material is assigned is this interesting thing hanging on the wall. And look at how the light from this is brightening up the ceiling above, the floor below, and very nicely all around the fixture. This brick wall is getting some nice illumination. Here we go. We're going to bring back up, change the wattage of that object on the wall. I'm going to interpret that in the form of a question. And so the question is, can you change the wattage? And the answer is, if you right-click on that object and you go back to edit it, you'll find that you can dial up or down the wattage with no problem. You can also do what we're going to do, which is use and I want to clarify, one of the reasons that you might want to use the method that we're going to use is if we've committed our computer to presentation rendering, that of course takes time. And so I might make a note to myself that for future, with this model, I want that to be a 20-watt bulb. But for now, I'm trying to get to my presentation on time, so I'm going to balance the lighting using the light channels dialog. So for example, the ceiling light, I've reduced the brightness. You'll notice I went from a 0.5 value down to a 0.1. So that dims that overhead light, and then look at the result in the rendering. So that overhead light I felt like was a little too bright. And in order to adjust that, I don't necessarily always want to return to SketchUp and make changes to the actual components when I'm able to post-process rendering and hopefully get to my meeting on time. We also have some really nice additional features, by the way. This is kind of as an aside, but for post-processing renderings, these features are very, very useful because I think all of us from time to time, once a rendering is completed, we want to make some adjustments to the rendered image. So for example, when a room is not brightly lit, and by the way, this is a very important photorealistic issue. When a room is not brightly lit, the saturation of color, if you reduce it some, will actually enhance the photorealism of the rendering. So I'm doing this in the iRender Next render window, not in SketchUp, and not copying my rendering out to an imaging program like Photoshop. With iRender Next, you'll find that that's frequently unnecessary. So I've reduced the color saturation in the entire rendering, making the colors a little bit more subtle and the rendering itself more realistic. I grabbed this image from a rendering tip that I posted to YouTube not long ago. This model is illuminated completely by indirect lighting. I have this cove up above, and what I do is I add light fixtures, ten of them. These are spotlights. You can see that the wattage is actually quite low. I've specified the color for them. I've specified the lighting channel. All of these spotlights are pointing up. By the way, of course, you can use any type of light source that you want. For my purposes in this model, spotlights worked perfectly. And now I get this wonderful indirect lighting solution for this simple little model. So keep in mind, what we're striving to do is present a design for a space that includes the type of lighting that we are proposing. In this case, just a nice wash of indirect lighting in this space. So again, you'll notice that with the model, I selected a light fixture. In this case, from the components dialog, this is just a quick, I don't know how much you all have played with this, but there are lots of options for lighting. And if you wanted to, for example, just place a bare bulb into maybe a light fixture that you've constructed with SketchUp, or maybe one that you've built on your own, here's your opportunity to do that. Just place the bulb. What I wanted was this spotlight. And I wanted it because I wanted a fairly narrow beam that also, interestingly enough, gave me very nice hot spots in that area above this ceiling. And the room then is being completely illuminated by bounced light, first off of the ceiling, and then, of course, bouncing around all of the other surfaces in the model. Now this means I went way too fast, and because I went so fast, I'm certain there must be more questions about either our dialogues and how they're used. By the way, I do this a lot. When I use components, even from our library, these are fully editable SketchUp models. So I'll do things like change the material, maybe change the geometry some to make them my own. Sometimes it's a lot easier to do that than to start out and build your own completely from scratch. So feel free to do that. Just a material that has, okay, here's another question. How did you get the menu to change the wattage of that object on the wall? The way that you do that is I right-click on the material, and then I select from the pop-up that displays Edit Object. I'm going to back up. What we want to do in this case is we want to edit the material, and then you'll notice, well, okay, sorry. I want to make sure that I don't confuse anyone here. There are two ways to make a material behave as a light. One is to establish a glow property, and the other is to take an object in your model and use the set object properties dialog to treat that object as a light. In that example, the entire object will be treated as a light in your model. The surprise that you might get is that that may not mean just the bulb. In this case, it was pretty easy. I selected Edit the Material. Here's the Edit Material dialog, clicked on Glow, and using the slider bar or typing in any value that you want, you can specify the wattage for the bulb. Once the rendering is completed and you're using the iRenderNext render window, you don't right-click on the surface, you click using the left mouse button. That will give you the same opportunity to bring up the Edit Material dialog. And maybe that is not very obvious in iRenderNext. With the iRenderNext render window displaying, click on the material, and then you'll get the same pop-up menu from which you can select Edit Material. Your preset, okay, I have another question. Your preset ceiling squares and rectangular fixtures are just a material that has a wattage and drawn as a flat square SketchUp object. That is mostly true. The difference is they are not, for those, it's not glow that is set, it is treating those objects as a light. And the nice thing about treating them as a light is that you have the opportunity to set the value for how light emanates from the object, whether it is, for example, just a bulb. So that would be multi-directional, or I'm sorry, omnidirectional, as in the case of a regular incandescent bulb. The light is actually escaping in an omnidirectional fashion. You can specify that the light will emanate from the bulb normal to the surface. In the case of a flat surface, that's fairly self-explanatory. In the case of a curved surface, that means normal to every facet of that component. And then, of course, you can specify that a fixture will be a spotlight. I'm sorry, not fixture, but the object that you're treating as a light can be a spotlight, in which case you will specify the angle of dispersion of the light. Now, Rich, are you more or less confused by that explanation? Okay. Rich is being a very nice guy, and he's telling me that that helped. Any other questions about artificial lighting in SketchUp models? By the way, I want to mention that on YouTube, you will find an introduction to iRenderNext, and in that introduction, there is an entire section that is also devoted to artificial lighting. That may be even another resource that will be really helpful if you're struggling with adding artificial lights to your SketchUp models. The biggest lesson of all from this webinar today is this: when you add a light fixture to a model, it's not just the brightness of the light itself that is important, it is the color. And again, I'm going to bring back this model because it illustrates that the color of the light, even in the most subtle shades off of white, has a dramatic effect on your rendering and will absolutely enhance the photorealism of the completed rendering.